thank you so much for the. Well, they were both useful in ways. There's some pictures that were the same, both of them. It's kind of interesting, but they're also fascinating.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Open Wednesday program of the bucket courses. I'm Joanne Bundy, and I want to remind you to turn off your cell phone and turn on your tea coil, if you would. A week from today, we are going to begin the first class of Clark Lindgren's course on criminal brains. And I've asked Clark to come in and tell you just a little bit teaser about what the program is going to be about. Please welcome Clark Lindgren.
Almost didn't make it out of my driveway this morning. So the topic that I'll be talking about is criminal behavior, what makes people commit crimes and what makes other people not commit crimes, which has been studied for the past roughly 100 years by criminologists from primarily a sociological perspective, and it's given very important insights into the various social factors that influence whether somebody will be a criminal or not. For example, their socioeconomic status, their home life, whether they had supportive parents, whether they, God forbid, had abusive parents, and their peer group and so forth. And those have yielded important insights, but more recently, particularly the last 10 to 20 years, the field of criminology has been looking at direct biological factors that predispose people towards crime. That's what I'll be focusing the course on. And most exciting, I think, surprising, sobering, but also hopeful, is that these biological factors have been shown to have this very powerful synergistic effect with these social factors that we've known about for a long time. Very, very powerful. So they're not simply additive factors like if you have certain biological predispositions and you have certain unfavorable sociological conditions, that those will sort of add up to increase the likelihood of you living a life of crime. It turns out there are very powerful synergistic effects, and so they're much more than additive. And that's both sobering, frightening, but it also shows some of the most excitement for things we can do in the future to reduce criminal behavior. So another minute?
Yep.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this in 4 steps, and I'm switching the order on a little bit from what I sent Joanne earlier, but I'm going to start off looking at the question of criminality from a biological perspective, and specifically from an evolutionary perspective. So how did criminality evolve, or probably a better way of putting it, how did the idea of punishing criminals evolve, and where did that come from? And I hope you'll find it's a little bit different perspective on the whole issue than you might have heard of before. Then we'll look at the genetics behind criminality, and studies that have used both adoption studies, twin studies, and now molecular genetic tools that have shown us that without question, absolutely without question, you're born with different predispositions towards a life of crime as opposed to somebody, and if you're sitting here criminal-free, you've never served a day in prison, I can guarantee that there are certain factors in your genetic makeup that have been important in that. Then we'll look at the brain, specifically what functional and structural differences can we see in the brains of criminals compared to the brains of people who don't commit crime. And that field is just blossoming, and it's growing very rapidly, and I'll only have time to cover some of what I consider the more important studies, particularly the ones that have looked longitudinally over children's lifetimes and have been able to map out changes in their brain, both structure and function, and then shown how that has increased their chances of choosing criminal behavior. Then quickly, the next topic will be looking at the ecology of crime. And what I mean by that is how do various environmental influences then alter brain function and structure in such a way that people will commit crime. Some of those you probably already know about. If you smoke when you're pregnant, your chances of your child becoming a criminal are greater. Drinking when you're pregnant. Also, various environmental influences will make a difference. And then I hope, if I still have time, I'm actually going to force myself to have time. So I want to end on a positive note, because there are some very positive things that have been happening now based on this, particularly this newer appreciation of the interplay between biology and sociology that have led to some very exciting changes in how different parts of the country are modifying their criminal justice system, and particularly for juvenile offenders in ways that are showing some great promise of actually reducing the recidivism rates and so forth. Did I make it? Okay, good. So hope to see you in a week. See you then.
Thank you very much. Now, if you have answered Jim Arn's email or signed up in Pearson, you are already registered for Clark's class. If you have not done that, we have forms out at the table in the hall, and you can register for the class. $15 tuition, and it's due next week, the first day of class. But today, we have a wonderful program for you. Barb Lease and her volunteers from the Grinnell Historical Museum are here to talk about Trailblazers, notable women in Grinnell's history. Please welcome Barb and her friends.
Thank you. I'd like to start with an introduction to our program. 161 years ago, the spot on which we are now gathered was a vast, almost treeless prairie. It took vision, courage, and hard work to build this town of Grinnell. And this town became home to gifted individuals who made important contributions to life here. Most of these individuals you've heard about, and they're men. The four founders, of course, Grinnell, Hamilton, Holyoke, and Hamlin. Early educators, Professor L.F. Parker and Colonel S.F. Cooper. Aviator, Billy Robinson. And manufacturers, F.W. Morrison, H.W. Spaulding, and B.F. Ricker, just to name a few. But 3 years ago, the Drake Community Library and the Grinnell Historical Museum created an exhibit for Women's History Month called Trailblazers, Notable Women of Grinnell. And that exhibit introduced to the community a group of women whose gifts, courage, and hard work made equally significant contributions. I must admit that I had never heard of most of these women, but I'm very glad I got to know them. They are an impressive group. The original exhibit featured 22 women. Since that was too many for a one-day bucket course, we have narrowed the list to 8. These women played meaningful roles in our community and sometimes in the state and in the nation. From the women who helped create farms and homes on the prairie to those who were lawyers, doctors, artists, writers, and more, this morning we salute these trailblazers. I think this probably gives you a hint as to who my woman is. If you have a farming background, you recognize this. This is a sunbonnet that a woman on a farm wore. We have several at the museum. This is from the museum. The notable women that you will hear about today are very accomplished women in the traditional sense of the word. They are musicians, photographers, political and social activists, writers, and so on. Eliza Ann Bartlett Howard was none of these. She was a pioneer woman. And I chose her specifically because I have a special place in my heart for these strong, faithful, hardworking women. My grandmother was a farm wife, and 3 of my great-grandmothers were farm wives, and there's probably more that I don't know about. I would venture to guess that many of you in this room could say the same thing. Pioneer women who lived on farms worked harder than most of us can even imagine. They endured the desolate and harsh environment of the early prairie, made more difficult by the isolation in which they lived. To me, Eliza Ann represents all the strong women who helped to settle the prairie. In most ways, Eliza Ann was no different from the other women on pioneer farms. What was different about her, though, is that she kept a diary, and it survived. It furnishes rare details about rural farm life for the earliest pioneers. It's one of the few surviving primary sources which describes a woman's life during the first years of Grinnell, specifically 1855 to 1863. In 1976, Eliza Ann's grandson, Ralph Longley, wrote a book about his grandmother's life in Grinnell based on that diary. He named it Cabin on the Second Ridge. Eliza Ann Bartlett was the eldest child of Stephen and Theodosia Bartlett, and the Bartlett family was one of the earliest families to the new town of Grinnell, arriving from Bath, New Hampshire on May 9, 1855, about 1 year after the founding of the town. In addition to Mr. and Mrs. Bartlett and Eliza, there were brothers Stanley, Emery, Moses, and sister Philomela. Mr. Bartlett bought a lot on Broad Street between 5th and 6th. That's where Bates Flowers is now. And he and Emery built a small house. At the time of their arrival, Eliza Ann was 27 years old, refined, well-educated, and unwed. In the day, she was past her prime, and she was considered an old maid. In November, 6 months after the Bartlett's arrival in Grinnell, a local farmer named Benoni Howard lost his wife and 6-week-old child. He was left with a young son named Charlie. He brought 4-year-old Charlie into town to board with the Bartletts in January. And he began to spend time with the family. Shortly after, Eliza and Benoni were engaged. These are Eliza's diary entries for the month of January in 1856. Notice Mr. H, that's Benoni Howard. You notice he's spending a lot of time. He's coming with them to meeting. He's coming to visit. And then you'll notice on January 27th, attended meeting, Mr. H came, we engaged. He spent the night, and believe me, in those days it does not mean what it means now. And then she commenced to write a letter to Mrs. Walker. Well, 2 months after that, they were married. A widowed farmer in those days with a small child to raise wasted no time in finding another wife. They moved immediately to the sod house on his farm 1 1/2 miles due west of Grinnell. The intersection of 146 and 6, if you go 1 1/2 miles due west, that was their farm. The pages of her diary describe days filled with work both inside and outside the house. Chores mentioned repeatedly include washing and ironing, working in the garden, harvesting and preserving vegetables from the garden, helping in the butchering and all associated with the butchering. Every fall, you read in her diary, tried the lard, cleaned the souse. She did all the cooking, baking, cleaning, and sewing. She also tried to be a mother to little Charlie, who was often in trouble, and as he got a little older, he even ran away quite a few times. The monotony of chores was broken by going into town to attend meeting, which was church services, singing school, which was choir rehearsal, and sewing society. Her husband was gone a lot. He was usually working away from home. He was known locally for his fine team of oxen, and so he was often away breaking prairie, which is the term they use, plowing, for other people. So Eliza Ann and Charlie were often alone on the farm. Her January 1st diary entry is here, and you can see she has not been to town but once for 37 days. On New Year's Day, she just wanted to see her family so badly, she started walking to town. This is January. And her brother, Stanley, met her. He was coming after her. So she stayed with them until the 4th, when Stanley brought her home, but the snow was drifted so high he couldn't get her all the way home, so she had to walk partway home anyway. And by the way, her husband got home 2 days later. On April 5th of that same year, she writes, "Did not go to meeting, very cold, it froze hard in the house last night." You know, they lived in a sod house. She writes several times about ice inside the house. On November 12th in 1859, she wrote, "Very cold, froze hard in the house, ice 2.5 inches thick in the pantry." On April 22nd, 1859, their only child, Alice, was born. The last month before the birth was a difficult one. These are the diary entries for April. You can see she does not feel well. Her sister-in-law Hannah and her sister Philo came up to help her clean house. Her father came to get her washing, and finally her sister came and got her and took her back into town to her parents' house. And there the baby was born on April 22nd. It weighed 8.5 pounds. In spring of 1862, there was a spotted fever epidemic in Grinnell. Spotted fever is typhus. And Eliza Ann was sick with it, along with a lot of other people, some of whom died. She did recover, but her health really never returned. So they moved into town, and I apologize, I thought you'd be able to see this a little better, but this is the early town of Grinnell from the book, Cabin on the Second Ridge, and the author changed all the names in the book, and that's why it says Goodell. It's really Grinnell. But I don't have my little pointer, but the cabin on the left side, let's see, yes, it would be the left side to you, and you can see there's a little house and there's smoke coming up out of the chimney. That's their cabin. Now, the northernmost road there is 5th Avenue, not 6th, because 5th was the stagecoach road. That was the main road right here in town. So if you went one more block up to 6th, you would see that that cabin was west of 6th. So anyway, they moved into town, the 4 of them, and they bought a house on the corner of Broad and 5th, so just 1 block up. She died less than a year after moving into that house on October 27, 1864, probably of consumption, which was tuberculosis. She was 36 years old. She's buried in Hazelwood Cemetery, and her parents raised Alice. And her parents, again, lived on the lot where Bates Flowers is now. Benoni Howard moved to California, and he married a 3rd time, and he died at age 74. I hope we will not forget that early pioneer women like Eliza Ann were equal partners with the men in the settling of the prairie. And while they were fortunate to witness the beauty of that virgin prairie, which will never be seen again, they also endured the monotonous physical labor of caring for a home and a family in that day and age, the isolation of farm life, the harsh environment of unceasing wind, bitter cold in the winter, prairie fires in the fall, and summer heat on the treeless plains. These were women with plenty of true grit.
Since Johanna Harris Haynes' writing is wonderfully clear and vivid, I'll rely heavily on her own words to tell her story, and I think you'll be glad I did. First, some clear and vivid writing from the Grinnell Herald Register, June 30th, 1931. A life intertwined in an intimate manner with the early history of Grinnell and Grinnell College reached its close when Mrs. Joanna Harris Haynes passed away at 10:20 on Monday morning. And now to Joanna's words. I was born November 24, 1843 in Butler County, Pennsylvania. My father became discontent with the farmland and began to look for a better location. By good fortune, he read of J.B. Grinnell's plans for a colony in north central and eastern Iowa. A church and a school of higher education were to be maintained. My father exclaimed, "That's the place for me." Soon afterwards, he decided to buy of Mr. Grinnell a farm of 80 acres for $4 an acre. When our family left for our new home in the spring of 1850, snow was still on the ground. The tenants traveled in covered wagons, pulled by yokes of oxen, and in a two-seated buggy drawn by two spirited horses, of which my father was very proud. The weather was very cold, but we had plenty of warm clothing. We stopped at several places where the men slept in the wagons, while mother and the girls put up in hotels or taverns, as they were called. The journey to Grinnell gave me the fulfillment of my dreams of the prairie. In 1855, there was not a tree within 3 miles of Grinnell. We could see for miles, and all my longing for vast open spaces was satisfied. Another thing I will remember for as long as I live was the magnificence of the wildflowers that made the prairie for miles in all directions one gorgeous mass of vibrant beauty. I learned to appreciate the extraordinary richness of the soil about Grinnell. My father brought with him the latest farming equipment, including a breaking plow, with which he was soon in demand to break the heavy sod of the prairie. In front of the plowshare and attached to the beam was a sharp knife that cut the sod ahead of the plow, thus producing a clean-cut line in the turnover and reducing the strain on the plow and the oxen. One childish horror I suffered, and not so childish either, came from the innumerable snakes that infested the prairie. We encountered them in all directions, and there were some very dangerous kinds, such as rattlers and copperheads. My brother kept us in a state of terror from his irrepressible habit of killing them in a reckless manner. His method was to pick them up by the tail and snap their heads off. And then the script says he brought the rattlers, but I'm hoping she means rattles, into the house by the score. Mr. Grinnell was always promoting some plan or other. He persuaded the trustees of Iowa College, then at Davenport, and seeking a more congenial location, to come to Grinnell and offered them as a gift 20 acres, which were accepted as the college campus. With the founder of the town, I recall with more feeling his good wife, Mrs. Grinnell, Junior Chapin. The two were an interesting contrast. She was reticent, serious, even severe. But with all her sadness of manner and restraint of words, Mrs. Grinnell is one of the bright lights of my girlhood and later womanhood. She was very kind in doing the little things that make life easier for children and neighbors. I shall never forget her gift to us of a bag of apples, the first we had in Grinnell, a kind of fruit we so longed for and could not obtain. The coming of Mr. and Mrs. L.F. Parker was a happy incident in the promotion of Grinnell as an educational center. Mr. Parker, who taught in our school, was a graduate of Oberlin, which to my youthful mind was the radiant center of all that was best. He illuminated the schoolroom and made our lessons vital. Mrs. Parker was then, and ever after, one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. Her brown eyes and gentle ways and gracious manner of addressing old and young alike gave her remarkable influence. The visits of John Brown on 2 occasions gave to Grinnell fame or infamy, according to one's view of his career and character. When he came to town with the 11 Negro slaves he had taken from their masters in Missouri, I saw and heard him. The town was agog with excitement. Many did not approve of his high-handed method of invading Missouri and kidnapping the slaves. Though they abhorred slavery, they realized interference might bring horrors of insurrection and civil war. Brown spoke in the church where the stone church now stands. He knew how to touch the quick of human feelings. Because of my parents' views on slavery, we were among the conductors of the Underground Railroad. It was a subject of little discussion around the table or the hearth. We children knew it was a dangerous topic, and talk of it might subject the family to arrest or attack, and we instinctively said nothing. One night, when I came home, I found a colored woman with a baby sitting by the fire. We heard mother and father whispering to one another and realized preparations were being made. In the morning, she and the baby were gone. My brother had taken them on their way. Needless to say, all this gave a particularly exciting turn to life for us and made us all as alert as crickets to the course of public events, especially those regarding slavery. Strangely, I do not recall much about the political discussions preceding the election of Abraham Lincoln. My mother and father were so extreme in their views that they looked upon Lincoln with indifference, if not with suspicion. However, the proclamation emancipating the slaves changed everything for us, and Lincoln became one of the fixed stars for our family. Similarly, my recollections of the Civil War are not as clear as they should be. 4 of my brothers and my father enrolled in the Army. My father's war experience was interesting. He was 58 years old, beyond military age. He joined the famous Graybeard Regiment, the 37th Iowa Infantry. The regiment saw considerable service in Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, and Ohio. At Indianapolis and Columbus, they guarded prison camps. Reluctantly leaving Mrs. Haynes' text, I can tell you that Joanna graduated from Grinnell College, or Iowa College, in 1865, a member of the college's first female class. Women were allowed to take a ladies' course, but could not earn at that time a BA. She did receive an MA from the college in 1925. She married a brilliant classmate, Robert M. Haynes. A natural teacher, she taught in the College Academy and Grinnell High School. Joanna and Robert had 5 sons and 2 daughters. The register reports that Mrs. Haynes was an object lesson in growing old gracefully. 2 years before she died, the pageant celebrating the 75th anniversary of the town was dedicated to her, and Joan Baker tells me that Haynes Hall is named after Joanna Harris Haynes. Joanna's life in Grinnell overlapped with that of Cornelia Clark, and I like to think they knew each other. I think they would have been friends. A resident of Grinnell all of her life, Cornelia was born July 4th, 1884. She lived at 1322 West Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. Raised by a strict father, she learned to entertain herself in her own home and yard. Her companions included a variety of animals: cats, turtles, grasshoppers, though toads were her admitted favorites. When she began taking pictures with her father's camera, against his will, by the way, she especially enjoyed photographing her cats, which she dressed in clothes and somehow trained to pose for her. When she was 16, Clark published a children's picture book of her cats titled Peter and Polly. Clark attended Grinnell College, where she published short pieces for The Unit, the college's literary magazine. She developed and printed film for classmates and took photos for the college catalog, winning numerous awards for her work. Eventually, her work was published not only all over America, but in England and Australia, in magazines such as Nature and the Journal of the American Museum of Natural History. Her unique pictures include close-ups of a monarch butterfly egg, which she enlarged 80 times, eyes on a potato, dew on I have 2 possibilities from the scripts here: dew on a button or dew on a bachelor's button. I prefer the latter, as I think. And a cherry pit with a worm in it. In 1928, Clark helped establish an herbarium for the college and became its honorary curator. She died of cancer in 1936 at age 52, admired and respected in her community. Like Emily Dickinson, Cornelia Clark developed her rare creativity without leaving her hometown or even her backyard.
Ada Hopkins was the motivator behind her more public younger brother, Harry Hopkins. Her career was in social services and the increasing relationship between public and private relief for the needy. She was born in September of 1882 in Nebraska, the first child of David Eldona Hopkins and Anna Pickett Hopkins. The family moved often across Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois, as Mr. Hopkins, known as Al, looked for success in the harness and leather industry. Anna Hopkins steered the family to Grinnell from Sioux City. Anna highly valued education and religion and was influenced by a Grinnell College bulletin that noted that Grinnell attracted cultivated and intelligent people. She also read that Grinnell had been founded as a temperance community, and the religious influence of the New England Congregationalists who founded the town remained strong. The Hopkins family moved to Grinnell in September of 1901, making their home at the corner of 6th and Elm Street. Ada, the Hopkins' oldest child and only daughter, entered Grinnell College the year they moved to town. During her 4 years there, Ada became a campus leader, holding student offices and editing the Unit, in which she frequently wrote pieces. In her junior year, she gave a prize-winning speech against child labor. During her college years, she was active in various areas of social work, such as the Grinnell Uncle Sam's Club, and experiment with the settlement house movement. Ada graduated in 1905, earning a degree in English literature and German. She was chosen outstanding senior, and at the commencement ceremony, she spoke on modern philanthropy, emphasizing efforts to curb tuberculosis, a disease thought of as the primary cause of poverty. Ada believed that women, as well as men, had a moral and religious responsibility to take an active role in the affairs of the community. Her career reflected the commitment. She entered graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania to study sociology, and then worked for the Philadelphia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. In 1908, Ada moved to New York City, where she worked with Christina Isabel McCall, head worker and founder of the Christodora Settlement House. Ms. McCall described the Christodora House as an early settlement house serving immigrant families living in the crowded slums of the Lower East Side of New York. Ada would have been experienced in settlement work after her Grinnell College experience with the Uncle Sam's Club. Ada's career is not as well documented as the career of her brother, Harry Hopkins, but he had high regard for his older sister and learned from her example about the nature and value of women's work in the public sphere. It was at Christodora House where Harry Hopkins, an important architect of the New Deal, was first introduced to social work and the need for social reform. And the Christodora House is still there in New York City. The following year, Ada took a position as registrar at the New York School of Philanthropy. In 1912, the Grinnell Charity Organization Society suffered from mismanagement and a shortage of money. It conducted an investigation into how county poor funds were being spent and reported that their methods needed some improvement.
The County Board of Supervisors and the Charity Organization Society joined forces to solve the problems. The new organization became known as the Social Service League. They made the somewhat radical proposal that a trained social worker be hired as overseer of the poor. The Grinnell Register reported in the July 25, 1912 issue that Ada Hopkins was being recommended for the new position. It noted that Ada wished to return to Grinnell for a time and was willing to accept the position at the rather small salary that Grinnell could offer. It's not clear why she wanted to return to Grinnell, but her mother's illness and subsequent hospitalization with tuberculosis may have been the compelling factor. It was indeed significant to have a professional social worker as overseer of the poor, especially in a small town like Grinnell with only 5,000 people. But what was even more radical was the combination of public and private funds within one agency for the purpose of providing relief to the needy. The complicated interrelationships between public and private relief became a reoccurring theme during Ada's brother, Harry Hopkins' career. His sister's early years in Grinnell with the Social Service League reinforced for him the importance of close cooperation between public and private spheres. Years later, an article in the Sunday Des Moines Register of February 2nd, 1935, gave Grinnell credit for the origination of the Iowa Plan, the plan used for the administration of relief, which at that time was the model used by the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, directed by Harry Hopkins. The plan had first been administered by his sister, Ada, during her time in Grinnell from 1912 to 1914. The plan was adopted in 1933 as the uniform plan required by the government throughout the United States. A volunteer-based program called Goodfellows was founded in Grinnell in 1913 by Ada Hopkins. It was organized to raise funds to purchase food for the needy, which would be delivered to disadvantaged families just before the holidays. Despite her success with the Social Service League, in June of 1914, Ada again left Grinnell and went to Pittsburgh to set up the Department of Social Services at the Carnegie School. She also was director of the Girls Division of the War Camp Community Service during World War I, and a longtime USO administrator. Sometime between 1920 and 1930, Ada was married to Frank Amy, an aviator and electrical engineer. A son, Richard, was born August 2nd, 1930. They made their home in Westchester, New York. In 1923, she took a faculty position in the Department of Sociology at the University of Washington in Spokane. Newspaper articles of speaking engagements refer to her as returning to or from her home in New York, but little is known about her private life. After her retirement, she returned to live with her husband in New York. Although highly successful in her own right, she said she felt honored to be known as the sister of Harry Hopkins. Ada died sometime after January of 1946, and it is unknown where she was buried. Her only son, Richard Amy, died in 2013 at the age of 93.
We'll take a short break.
Louise Miller was born in 1872, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander and Mary McCall Miller, who farmed near North Liberty in Johnson County, Iowa. Louise's father, later in his life, became the editor and publisher of the Oxford Journal. Louise taught school and was correspondent for the Oxford Journal. In 1892, Louise married Eugene Henley, just as she was entering the University of Iowa. He had come to Oxford as the superintendent of schools, a position he held for 9 years. Eugene then became superintendent of the Brooklyn schools for 6 years, and in 1905 he came to Grinnell as the new superintendent, a position he held for 23 years until his death in 1928. The Henleys had 2 daughters, Inez and Margaret, and lived in a fine home at 3rd and High Street. Picture? Okay, never mind. Maybe it'll come up later. In 1912, the Henley family took a trip to visit Yellowstone Park. They must have enjoyed it immensely because the following year they spent 6 weeks in Yellowstone as the manager and matron of the Roosevelt camp. Louise sent back letters to the editor of the Grinnell Register, which were later printed in a book by the name Letters from the Yellowstone, published in 1913 by Ray and Frisbee of Grinnell. I did that already. Louise enjoyed writing and wrote a weekly article for the Grinnell Herald Register. She was a member of the American Pen Women, serving as national secretary and vice president of the organization. She was also involved in many other organizations, both locally and nationally, being active in both political and civic circles, gaining a national reputation in women's activities. As a member of the Federation of Press Women in Kansas City, she was honored with the Malik Award for outstanding work as a freelance writer. She was a member of the Des Moines Business Club, served as president of the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs, and was a member of the National Society of Parliamentarians. As a leader in the Iowa PEO Sisterhood, Louise served as a life trustee of Cody College in Missouri. During World War I, Louise was Poweshiek County chairman of the Women's Division of the Council of National Defense, vice chairman of the County Red Cross, director of the Community Hospital Social League, and a member of Eastern Star. In 1920, she became a charter member of the Iowa State Historical Society and helped to begin the monthly publication called the Palimpsest, which was devoted to the history of Iowa. The July 1945 issue printed an article by Louise Henley entitled Independence Day in 1845. In 1940, she was included in the Iowa Press Association's Who's Who in America. Louise was named temporary chairman of the Iowa Republican Convention and delivered the keynote address in 1944. As a daughter of the War of 1812, Louise became quite active in DAR. A Grinnell Herald article in 1929 reported that as a member of DAR, wall display cases were donated to the Stewart Library. Members of the community were asked to loan or donate items of historical interest to the library. In 1949, Louise served as state DAR regent. As a member of the Methodist Church, she frequently filled the pulpit in the absence of the pastor. Louise enjoyed world travel for many years, having toured Mexico and South America after the end of World War II, and later Spain and other European countries. She served as a member of the Board of Trustees of Stewart Library from 1928 to 1950, 22 years. She filled that position after the death of her husband, who had served on it previously. She was a very active member in charge of the Building and Grounds Committee, the Employees Committee, and acting as coordinator of library and local war activities. The minutes of the Board of Trustees on December 9th, 1942 included a report by Mrs. Henley stating that arrangements were being made for the establishment of a USO center for the use of the men in the Officers Candidate Training School. She offered suggestions of ways in which the library could help in furnishing books and magazines for the reading room of the center. In the minutes of Mrs. Henley's time on the board, they state that she organized a monthly book review tea with Mrs. Bray, the librarian. She arranged for the purchases of the flag and standard for the library grounds, voted to hire Miriam Dunham as librarian in 1945 with a yearly salary of $1,800. Visiting other libraries in the East, she commented that her own town library compared favorably. Her last appearance at a Stewart Library Board meeting was in December of 1949. Louise Miller Henley died May 27, 1950. A cleaning woman found her dead sitting at her desk. She had been in failing health since being struck and injured by an automobile in 1948. She was buried at Hazelwood Cemetery in Grinnell next to her husband Eugene and daughter Inez. The following was written about her. Be it resolved by the Board of Trustees of Grinnell Stewart Library that our board has suffered an irreparable loss in the death of our member, Mrs. Louise M. Henley. Her deep, abiding interest in libraries in general, and our own library in particular, and her long service as a board member made her invaluable to us. No one ever had a larger or more devoted circle of friends. Her interests were worldwide, and her contacts in connection with those interests were many and varied. Her personal sorrows were stepping stones to larger service to others. Her unfailing courtesy, her fairness, her kindness, and generous attitude towards others endeared her to us all. She was interested in all civic activities and gave freely of her time and wise counsel to those in need of assistance. Her personal life was characterized by her friendliness, loyalty, and devotion. Our board has lost a faithful and efficient member, and each of us has lost a friend. Mrs. E.B. Morrison, June 15, 1950.
Elizabeth Letitia Moon Connor was born on May 9, 1871 in Fawcington, Pennsylvania to Quaker parents. She received her early education at the Fawcington Friends School and Westtown Boarding School, and then attended Smith College, earning both a BA in 1894 and an MA in 1897. After a year of study at the Sorbonne in Paris, she returned to complete her PhD in comparative religions at the University of Chicago in 1899. The following year, she married Henry S. Connard, then at the University of Pennsylvania. The Connards came to Grinnell in 1906 when Henry Connard, for whom the Connard Environmental Research Area is named, took a faculty position in botany at Iowa College, now Grinnell. In 1909, they moved into a home at 1310 Elm Street, where their 3 children, Elizabeth, Rebecca, and Alfred, were raised. Elizabeth later went into medicine, and in the 1930s was associate professor of obstetrics in Shanghai, China. Rebecca is known to many of you. She later returned to Grinnell and the family home on Elm Street with her husband, Porter French. Among her publications, I missed something here. In 1925-26, after raising her family, Letitia Connard resumed her studies at Columbia University in economics and sociology. Upon her return to Grinnell, she took a half-time position, first in the Department of Economics and subsequently in the newly formed Department of Sociology, teaching for 15 years without compensation. Among her publications is an article in the January 1939 issue of the American Journal for Sociology, entitled Differential Depression, Effects on Families of Laborers, Farmers, and the Business Class, a survey of an Iowa town. The unnamed town in central Iowa, 60 miles from the capital city, is no doubt Grinnell. The article provides us with a detailed snapshot of the area in a period of economic stress and is indicative of our ongoing concern for the impoverished and the conditions in which they lived and worked. Almost upon arrival in Grinnell, she became a dedicated volunteer at Uncle Sam's Club, which was located on the corner of 3rd and Pearl in the Happy Hollow area of southwest Grinnell, and which provided programs and classes for youth and low-income families. The Bugler was the Uncle Sam newspaper, and the key in the lower left is the original building key. She was responsible for establishing the Uncle Sam's Mothers Association, an outgrowth of the Julia Grinnell Maternal Association, and came to know most of the families in the area. It was said that she was a godsend to these people. She knew what each family had had for breakfast, if they did. She and her husband were also generous supporters of the Social Service League, with occasional service on the board of directors. In 5 years, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Though this picture is not of the activity in Grinnell, it represents the spirit of the women's suffrage movement, of which Letitia Cunnard was an avid supporter. Go back.
Go back. Yeah.
I love the caption here. Never scared. They had very good reason to be. In 1920, the League of Women Voters was founded to train women and encourage their participation in political life. In 1923, she was instrumental in the founding of a chapter in Grinnell and also served on the state board of the League on economic welfare for over a decade, working for better protective laws for working women. She took the lessons of the League to heart, for she was one of the founding members of the Iowa Civil Liberties Union. Politics and pacifism were keen interests, and she involved herself in the campaign of Robert M. La Follette, progressive candidate for president in 1924, putting up posters and making speeches in schools and meeting halls. In response to an editorial in the Des Moines Register in 1932, opposing public ownership of municipal industries and utilities as a great subordinating of the individual to the dictation of government, she published an eloquent rebuttal in the Register stating that the issue is not between inefficiency or efficiency, or between individual initiative or individual subordination. It is between service for all and profit for a few. She signed the letter Letitia M. Cunnard, socialist candidate for governor. Yes. In 1932, she did throw her hat in the proverbial ring and ran for governor on the socialist ticket. She ran for Congress from the 5th District of Iowa in 1934 and for United States Senate in 1936. The first woman to run for the Senate from Iowa, receiving 1,233 votes statewide. In a 1933 interview, she stated that welfare work, the World War, and women's suffrage were the issues that had drawn her to socialism and the Socialist Party. A friend described her beliefs as 4 isms: internationalism, pacifism, socialism, humanitarianism. On occasion, she has been termed a radical socialist, but perhaps we could think of her rather as a woman ahead of her time, for her positions and the causes she espoused are today very much in the mainstream. Letitia Moon Connor died on November 29, 1946, and is buried in Westfield Cemetery. Fanny Buchanan was born in 1875 in Victor, Iowa. As a child, she moved with her family to Grinnell, where her father became a partner in the real estate and insurance firm of Buchanan and Smith. The family resided in their home on the corner of 6th and East, which burned only 2 years ago. Educated in Grinnell School, she graduated from Iowa College with a major in piano, and then taught privately in Grinnell until World War I. In 1914, she was involved in the organization of the first campfire group in Grinnell. In the same year, she later moved to New York City, where she organized special recreational programs for the war camp community service, training young women to serve as hostesses for members of the armed forces, or gobs and doughboys, as she referred to them. This was perhaps a forerunner of the USO in World War II. In 1920, she began work with RCA Victor, and with the assistance of state agricultural colleges, traveled to rural areas and schools throughout the country, introducing various groups to the choice of classical music, opera, and folk dance. In 1929, she returned to Iowa once again and took a position as the first music extension assistant with Iowa State College, which enabled her to travel to 4-H clubs and women's groups throughout the state, all 99 counties, organizing musical events and teaching folk dancing. One participant noted a wonderful twinkle in her eyes and the lilt of her head, as well as her delightful demonstrations of how dance steps should be done. At the Iowa State Fair each year, she presented 2 half-hour programs each day at the Women and Children's Building, and at the annual 4-H meetings in Iowa State was responsible for organizing the grand finale on the last night. One year, this involved erecting 50 maypoles on the central campus and training 4-H participants in technique at 6 in the morning, the only free time for rehearsal. Another grand finale featured many small bonfires, around which the girls performed gypsy dances. The rural women's choruses she organized held annual festivals in Des Moines with as many as 1,000 women singing together on stage. Iowa was one of 2 states selected to appear in a rural women's chorus at the New York World's Fair. And in 1935, she adapted M.W. Bough's The Bohemian Girl for presentation in Ames with a cast composed of 200 farmers, their wives and daughters, before an enthusiastic audience of 6,000. The Omaha Herald referred to it as the Barnyard Opera. During this period, she continued to write books and articles for children's magazines, which appeared in such publications as Story Parade and Youth Companion. And in 1935, wrote the first edition of How Man Made Music, at the suggestion of Myrtle Park's Cooper School principal, who assisted her in adjusting the text for elementary school use. Of lasting impact were the lyrics to the 5 songs she wrote from 1927 to 1933 with Raina Parrish, who had also been a music student at Grinnell. The plowing song was inspired by her experiences with 4-H boys, who she realized were not just learning animal husbandry, but acquiring lessons of mental application, which would stay with them for all their lives. In dreaming the 4-H song for girls, according to Raina Parrish, each girl may silently and inwardly be fashioning the air castle that will mean joy and life to her. Incidentally, the illustrations on the cover sheets were the creation of Cornelia Clark, another of our notable women. The songs were later adopted officially by the National 4-H movement and continue to be used. Following her retirement after a serious car train accident, she returned to Grinnell to live in a small house she built, the Wee House, on East Street, where she continued to write until her death in 1957. The Wee House was later the home of Paul and Margaret Matlock Kiesel, and it was Maggie Kiesel who compiled the documentation for Buchanan's nomination to the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame in 1984. As part of her contribution to this effort, Mary Edna Sherman wrote, "In my estimation, there probably has been no other woman in the history of Iowa who has contributed more to the cultural enlightenment of rural Iowans." Fanny Buchanan's niece, Barbara Bates Howell, celebrated her as the true personification of a blithe spirit. Among her other tributes, Buchanan had been recognized in 1941 by the National 4-H Club Camp, and in 1944 by the National 4-H Club Congress. In 2002, she was inducted posthumously into the Iowa 4-H Alumni Hall of Fame and the National 4-H Hall of Fame in 2007. In 1923, again with Rita Parrish, she wrote the lyrics to the song Iowa, which expresses her deep and abiding love for her home state. Iowa, the smiling prairie with her miles of waving corn, with her wide-flung golden sunset and her clover-scented morn. Iowa, the smiling prairie with her rolling fields of wheat. Iowa, the garden of the world where earth and heaven meet. It's your turn.
If I had lived, is it on? If I had lived on Ninth,
If I had lived.
if I had lived on 9th Avenue between Main and Broad, where I live now, in the first half of the 20th century, Wilma Isabel Rayburn would have been my neighbor. She grew up in Grinnell, the only child of Will and Isabel Rayburn, living at 1404 Broad Street. She would not have had far to go to college. She graduated from Iowa College in 1917 with a degree in history. These are photos of her high school graduation picture from the Grinnellian and from the Cyclone 4 years later. She doesn't look too much different. Her father, Will, was a prominent lawyer in the county and was influential in getting her interested in the law. She entered Drake Law School in 1923 and received her law degree in 1925. Practicing law with her father until his death in 1931, Wilma then went into partnership with the freshly minted Drake Law grad, Chester Chrisman. She purchased property on 4th Avenue and built a, quote, modern one-story face tile office building in 1934, now the home of headquarters and the firm of Rowland and Dealman. According to a 1934 article in the Grinnell Herald, the building was to be very modern and equipped with a fireproof vault. When the partnership with Chrisman ended soon after the date of this ad, she practiced solo until she left Grinnell in 1946. During the years she practiced law in Grinnell, she was particularly active in two local organizations, Campfire Girls and the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Hey, Sharon, you might want to catch Betty up with your slides.
Betty? Betty is asleep at the wheel. Okay, keep going. All right. Campfire Girls, beating in a handbook. Miss Rayburn was an early advocate
advocate for the reorganization of the Campfire Girls in town, believing that the Girl Scout organization was too scouty. Next. In 1928, she was instrumental in securing the camp property west of town, Camp Hawiku, within hiking distance of Grinnell, which I found out was 5 to 6 miles. A cabin was built later by H.L. Triplett. According to an article in the 1928 Grinnell Register, there were 13 groups of Campfire Girls in Grinnell, with a total membership of 113. In 1932, an additional 29 acres was added to the property when Miss Rayburn's mother took a mortgage on the land for $1,240. Even closer. In 1972, the Girls Camp Association celebrated its 40th anniversary, and the Herald Register article included a photo of Miss Rayburn, who was living in Roanoke, Virginia by then. WCTU was organized in Grinnell at the end of 1874, 1 year after the national founding of this organization. In a history of the local union documenting the years from 1874 to 1924, it was noted they were instrumental in abolishing fermented wine at the Congregational Church. Encouraged sellers of cigarettes to refrain from selling to minors, brought about public restrooms at the Grinnell Fair, and other public health and sanitation issues in town. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the organization continued their promotion of social reform issues for a few more years. According to the college's alumni records, Wilma Rayburn left Grinnell in 1946 to go to Columbia University in New York and studied for a master's degree in the teaching of history. Then she moved to Virginia to teach school. Now is when things get interesting. When we first put up the exhibit of these notable women 3 years ago, I did what any good researcher would do, troll the internet for information. Nothing much turned up for Miss Rayburn. However, this time around, my search brought up a blog called Exceptional Poet. The assignment for the blog participants was, write a poem or story about some person who impacted your life in an unusual way. A former student of Miss Rayburn's from Montvale in Bedford County, Virginia, responded to the assignment in May of 2014. He says, I smiled as I read the instructions and thought, only one person for that slot in my life, Miss Wilma Rayburn, an ex-lawyer, school teacher from Grinnell, Iowa, unquote. Let me read what he wrote, and I'll read it just as he wrote it. I'm guessing the time period is the 50s. Montvale is a tiny burg named because it's located in the valley between the Blue Ridge Mountains. That was her in 1972, and she probably looked about like that when she was teaching him in the 50s. All right, now we need a map. Okay. Well, we had a new teacher in the high school, Miss Wilma Rayburn from Grinnell, Iowa. I never found out how she came to pick our school, but she did. She had that lawyer-teacher voice, and it stopped people. She had her ideas, and we sure as heck would hear them. The first class under her was American government. We all subscribed to a magazine and read newspapers and discussed what we read in class. If it was a big or hot topic, we would discuss it for a few days. Me, I just read all the magazines and the newspaper each day, cover to cover, so topics I had. Also, when a word was used that was not familiar to us, we all had our dictionaries, and we had to look it up and read what it said. Vocabulary development, oh yes. We had to do research papers and present them on federal, state, county, and local laws and discuss them. Well, defend what we said. This to me was great, for it made us widen our horizons, spread out our thinking, and give some of us a more in-depth look at laws and happenings. Then we studied communism, and were split into groups to prepare papers on the topic. Now this was way back then, and you were forced to read, study, and listen to find out what was going on and what was in the middle. I can to this day look up at the ceiling, close my eyes, and quote from my paper about how to thwart communism. It obviously did not take long for her to quickly learn who was smart, who was dumb, who was just skating, and who had potential. The few at the top worked much harder, for we had brains and could go places. Now let me say, this old woman and I fought, argued, and battled, for she was my first and foremost enemy. But after I left school, I realized what this teacher had given me, how she had made me think, dig, and try and read something she did not know so I could stump her. I think this woman saw through me and realized how wasted school was, for there was no challenge, well, except in her classroom. And oh yes, how I rue the day or days that I did not go back and thank her after I left school and before she passed on. That woman had more effect on my life, even to this day, than anyone, for she made me think, see both sides of any and every picture, and even fence straddle and defend my thoughts. Yes, that woman from Iowa had a tremendous effect on my life. This first-hand account of who Miss Rayburn was and how she taught tells us more about her than any newspaper article or research paper. I think you'll agree that she seems to have been a formidable presence in the classroom. A tiny obituary appeared in the Grinnell Herald-Register in February of 1989. Miss Wilma Rayburn, 92, died in a convalescence center in Roanoke, Virginia, 16 miles down the Blue Ridge Boulevard from Montvale High School. She's buried in Nevada, Iowa, near her parents. We'd like to introduce who we all are, and I should tell you who the presenters are in order. Barb Lease, Betty Moffett, Julie Young, Dory Lalonde, and I'm Cheryl Newbert. There is one person on our team who could not be here today. Ann Igoe provided hours of technical assistance and indeed put together the PowerPoint slides we use today from long distance. She encouraged us, assured us, and generally said that she thought we'd be fine doing this presentation on our own. Time will tell. In her stead, we commandeered the help of Monique Shore, who is here with us today. Thank you, Monique. In addition, we'd like to recognize Karen Groves for her tireless efforts in researching these notable women. These women were no ordinary women. They were extraordinary women of Grinnell who made a difference in the town in which they grew up. We celebrate their accomplishments, their vision, their talents, and their perseverance when women were not always welcome front and center. We hope that we've given you a glimpse into their lives, challenges, and dreams. Today we focused on 8 women. There are more. Invite us back sometime. We have more stories to tell. Thank you for coming.
Well, it's good to know that we have some notable women in Grinnell ourselves, isn't it? Thank you very much, ladies. That was very interesting indeed. Next week, I want to remind you too that the bookcases, display cases out in the hallway are from the Grinnell Historical Museum. And they change every once in a while, so please take time to look at those. They're always very interesting. And next week, Clark Lindgren will start on his 4-week course on criminal brains. Hope to see you all back then. If you haven't registered for his course, you can sign up out in the hallway. Thank you for coming this morning. I'll see you next week.